Hazorim, Bedima Yiksoiru, those who reap in tears. No, those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy, sung by Shlomo Katz. How are you, my holy brothers and sisters? It is great to be back. Let's light up the darkness. Big show, as you can imagine. We're going to be doing highlights from all these days that we have been apart. 11 days, lots to cover. Who is with us as we get it going on a Monday night? A highlight show from all these days while you and I have been reading independently. Paula in Chicago, Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Stay tuned, Sharon, reading your dedication in a moment. Gwen in Michigan, Renee in Indiana, Tom saying welcome back, everyone. Steve asking me, how did your golf go? I was in Florida trying out for Team USA for the Masters golf team going to the Maccabiah Games in Israel next year. I did not qualify. I was in way over my head. There was some amazing, amazing golfers there, and I really just don't play at the level that I could have made that team. However, I have been a Maccabiah athlete in the past. I was a rower in 1985. I went as a golfer to the Pan Am Games in 2015. And in addition to the sort of golf captains and coaches at these tryouts in Palm Beach, there were some of the officials from the national Maccabiah movement, Jeff Buchans and Lou Moyerman. It was great to bond with them. And I let them know that really my dream is to go to the games as a public speaker and address the delegation and talk to them about how the Maccabiah Games were an important part of my Jewish journey. And, you know, how that Jewish journey is such a rich opportunity for everybody, right? Not just to connect with Israel for those 2 weeks that you're there, but, you know, so many Jews are disconnected from the tradition, and this could just be the first step, the launching point of a lifelong journey of learning and sharing the wisdom of our sages. And told them a little bit about my personal story. And we'll see. Certainly nothing is settled, but they love the idea of bringing me in, and that really was my higher purpose anyway. So there's a good chance that it might work out, but there's a lot of, finagling and talking and working out. No big institution like this makes decisions so quickly. So we'll see, but hopefully I'll be a speaker there next summer. Christo says, glad you're finally back. Miriam in Colorado, Melissa in Great Neck, Rochelle in Modesto, Bill in Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Stephen in Oklahoma, Stephen in New Hampshire, Christo in Lubbock, Deborah in Guatemala, San Pedro de la Laguna, where there's a Chabad and kosher food. That's fantastic. Please give my regards to the Shliach. Tom says, I need this tonight. Carolyn in Raleigh. Bella says, Shalom. John in Sedona, whom I just saw here in LA. It was great to see you. Dorothy in Pittsburgh. Paul in the Great Northwest. David in Notre Dame. Over there on the YouTube side. Seraphim in Sacramento. Lynn in North Texas. Lindsay in Cincinnati. And Gigi, I believe, in British Columbia. Welcome, everybody. So great to be together again. And we're in Elul. This is the final month of the Hebrew year. We're already gearing up, getting ready for Rosh Hashanah and the days of awe, and it's the practice to blow the shofar every day during the month of Elul. So let's have a blast dedicated to the accidental Talmudist community. Might have overmodulated the microphone a little bit. Hopefully not too bad. Okay, tonight's class is dedicated by Sharon Fran Brooks, a great student in our class and teacher as well. And she's dedicating our learning tonight for the yahrzeit of her grandmother, Tilla Fran. That was on the 4th of Elul, a few days ago. And her uncle, Jacob Fran, and her mother, Frida Fran, whose yahrzeit was on the 5th of Elul. May their memories always be for a blessing. May the merit of our learning resound to their credit in the world of souls. And may their neshamas have a great elevation. And Sharon, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for sponsoring our class and enabling us to share more Torah with more people. We say Amen. Okay. Let's get into it. Like I said, so as I mentioned before I left, and now that I'm back, a lot of days apart. So obviously we can't cover all these pages. We're going to be looking at pages 29 through 40 here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Sukkot. This tractate has 5 chapters. The first chapter is all about the technical requirements of the Sukkah. Chapter 2 is about how we fulfill the mitzvah, the obligation to reside in the Sukkah during Sukkot. We're going to finish that and then get into chapter 3 in some depth tonight. And that is all about the laws of the lulav and the esrog, the 4 species that we wave during Sukkot. So we pick it up, and like I said, we're just going to be covering the most salient points. So this is going to be kind of an awesome class in the sense that every since we're doing the highlights of these last 11 pages, there's a lot of beautiful, beautiful teachings. We'll have to keep moving, but it's some beautiful pearls tonight. All right, picking it up on page 29, or actually the bottom of 28 on the B side, the 10th Mishna of chapter 2. I'm going to do all of the Mishnas. That's definitely our class policy. We always cover the Mishnah, and then the Gemara is the commentary on the Mishnah. So, Mishnah number 10 of chapter 2, all 7 days of Sukkot, a person renders his sukkah, the booth that we dwell in during that week, renders his sukkah, his permanent residence, and his house, his normal home, as his temporary residence. If rain fell, from when is it permitted to vacate the sukkah? Right? If rain is falling on the sukkah, and we know that we have to be able to see the stars through the roofing of the sukkah, it is by definition not waterproof. So if rain is dripping on us and the idea is to sleep and eat there, that's not going to work very well. So if rain is falling, from when is it permitted to vacate the sukkah? It is permitted from the point that it is raining so hard that the congealed dish will spoil. And the sages told a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a servant who comes to pour wine for his master, and he pours a jug of water in his face to show him that his presence is not desired. Who is the he? Is it he the master or he the servant? We'll get to that momentarily. And he pours a jug of water in his face to show him that his presence is not desired. So too, in the sukkah, rain is an indication that the Holy One, blessed be he, does not want the person to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah at that moment. Now the Gemara on this Mishnah, the sages taught all 7 days of Sukkot, a person renders his sukkah, his permanent residence, turn off the air conditioning, renders the sukkah his permanent residence and his house his temporary residence. How so? If he has beautiful vessels, he takes them up to the sukkah, which was typically built on the roof. Why do you take it up to the sukkah? Because often in the the housing situations that for most people at the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, people lived in these 2-story homes and they built the sukkah on the roof. And so he takes his beautiful vessels up to the sukkah. If he has beautiful bedding, he takes it up to the sukkah. He eats and drinks and relaxes in the sukkah as if it's his permanent residence. And the Gemara asked, from where are these matters derived? And the Gemara explains that it is as the sages taught, in Sukkot, plural, in Sukkot shall you reside, Leviticus 23:42. And the sages interpreted, reside, as you dwell in your permanent home. From here, they said, all 7 days, a person renders his sukkah his permanent residence and his house his temporary residence. How so? If he has beautiful vessels, he takes them up to the sukkah. If he has beautiful bedding, he takes it up to the sukkah. He eats and drinks and relaxes in the sukkah and studies Torah in the sukkah. Now, not everybody has this ability. Most people who build a sukkah will certainly have all their meals in the sukkah. Ideally, we would also sleep in the sukkah. Not everybody is able to do that depending on where they are, how cold, the situation, insects, animals, etc. If possible, it's good to sleep in the sukkah. Our practice is we like to sleep at least one night in the sukkah if possible, but certainly to take all of our meals in the sukkah and to study Torah in the sukkah, etc. Some people build sort of more sealed sukkahs in terms of the walls, a little bit elevated off the ground, a nice wooden platform, so kind of animals and critters, not so much an issue. And then they do indeed bring the beds in the sukkah and sleep there all week. That is ideal if it's possible, not possible for everybody. Skipping a little. The Mishnah continues, the sages told a parable to what is this matter comparable. This idea that if it rains in the sukkah, it means that God is unhappy with us. It is during Sukkot. It is comparable to a servant who comes to pour wine for his master, and he pours a jug of water in his face. And a dilemma was raised before the sages. Who poured the water in whose face? And come in here, a proof as it was taught explicitly in a Baraisa. His master poured a jug of water on his face and said to him, I do not want your service, right? So we can't dwell in the sukkah if it's raining hard. We're not able to perform that mitzvah. Who caused it to rain? God caused it to rain. And so there's this idea that rain during Sukkot is understood to be kind of a bad omen. God is unhappy with us. It's interesting because during Sukkot, we are praying for the rain in the rainy season that is to come. Winter is the rainy season in Israel. So we want that rain to come, but not just yet. Apropos the fact that rain on Sukkot is an indication of divine rebuke, the Gemara cites several related topics. The sages taught when the sun is eclipsed, it is a bad omen for the entire world. And the Gemara tells a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a king of flesh and blood who prepared a feast for his servants, and he placed a lantern before them to illuminate the party. And he became angry at them, and he said to his servant, take the lantern away from before them and let them sit in the dark. It was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Meir says, when the heavenly lights, i.e. the sun and the moon, are eclipsed, it is a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. So throughout the Talmud, whenever it says the enemies of the Jewish people, it means the Jewish people. Usually in a situation where we're acting, we're misbehaving vis-a-vis God's commandments, and so we are acting as our own enemies because we're incurring God's displeasure. So when the heavenly lights are eclipsed, the sun and the moon, it's a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people, meaning us, because they are experienced in their beatings. What does this mean? Based on past experience, the Jewish people assume that any calamity that afflicts the world is directed at them. Now, are we saying that anything terrible that happens in the world, it's because of the Jewish people, and even though others are suffering the calamity? No, that's not exactly what it means. However, anything that happens in the world, we can and should say, what lesson can we take from that in order to improve our own behavior, in order to improve our Torah observance, in order to do better in this world. What lesson can we take from it? Now, the Gemara suggests a parable. This is similar to a teacher who comes to the school with a strap in his hand, right? The teachers used to beat the kids, not in the 21st century, but it used to be pretty common. The teachers would, take a rod or a strap and they would smack the naughty kids, not everybody. So this is similar to a teacher who comes to the school with a strap in his hand. Who worries? The child who is accustomed to be beaten each and every day is the one who worries. Since the Jews have endured so many calamities in our history, so many persecutions, it's not so far-fetched to think that whenever something bad goes in the world, we start to get worried, what's coming next? How are the Jews going to suffer from this latest calamity? And, all too often, we do suffer from every calamity. Skipping a little, the sages said, there is no nation that is afflicted whose God is not afflicted with it. As it is stated, Exodus 12:12, and against all the gods of Egypt, I will mete out judgment. I am God. Now, we know that there is only one God. So what are these plural gods with a small g? In this situation, what we're talking about is these kind of like heavenly intercessors on behalf of the other nations. In other words, the guardian angels, right? So every nation has its own guardian angel. And so there is no nation that is afflicted whose guardian angel is not afflicted, right? And this is that more general lesson that as below, so above, right? Things that are happening in our realm have an effect on the upper realm, right? And what happens here, even though we live these very brief lives, like incandescent lives, alongside the eternal beings of the world of souls. We are eternal beings. We come from the world of souls. God is an eternal being. The angels are eternal. Human lifetimes are like nothing. They're like that. And yet, this realm is a place of tremendous importance. The world was created in order to have this realm where God's presence is hidden, where people fear death and are mortal and have a choice to make every second of the day to do right, to follow God's commands or to follow our own, animal urges. And every time we do the right thing, it has an effect up above. That's part of this lesson. And when the Jewish people perform God's will, they need not fear from these omens that have been cited above about heavenly bodies being eclipsed, lunar eclipse, solar eclipse, etc. But when we do God's will, we don't have to worry about omens. Thus says the Lord, Jeremiah 10:2, learn not the way of the nations and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven. For the nations are dismayed by these kinds of omens. The nations will be dismayed, but the Jewish people will not be dismayed as long as we are doing what we're supposed to do, as long as we're living a Torah life. Skipping a bit more. On account of 4 matters, the property of homeowners is delivered to the monarchy as punishment. People's property is seized by the government. What are these 4 matters? On account of those keepers of paid promissory notes who keep these documents instead of tearing them up. Somebody lent money, the money was paid back to them, and they should have returned the promissory note to the borrower. The lender kept that note. Why? Because he thinks one day maybe he can collect on it again. In other words, people who commit financial fraud. Right, so on account of those keepers of paid promissory notes who keep them, and on account of lenders with interest. Now, this is between Jews and Jews. A Jew cannot lend to another Jew at interest. There are special exceptions for that, so that small businesses can get loans. But that's a whole other body of law we'll come to later in our journey through the Talmud. Also, on account of those who had the ability to reprimand sinners and did not reprimand them, and on account of those who issued a commitment to give charity in public, right? In public, in front of their peers. They said, I'm going to pledge to give this big donation to that charitable cause, and then they don't give the money. that causes people to have their property seized by the government. The one who made the pledge and didn't live up to it, perhaps, is the one whose property will be seized by the government. Maybe even other people. It's a bad state of being when you have a society that condones that kind of behavior. Rav said, on account of 4 matters, the property of homeowners is confiscated by the state treasury, same idea, on account of those who delay the payment of the salary of hired laborers, right? That's a Torah commandment, very specific. You do not delay paying your employees. And do not and the ones who don't pay at all. And on account of those who throw off the yoke of communal responsibility from their own necks and place that yoke on the necks of their friends. People who say, well, things need to be done for the community. Somebody else will take care of it. I don't have to deal with it. We all have communal obligations, community responsibilities. We have to take them seriously. And on account of the arrogance of those who, due to their wealth, exercise power over the community. And the punishment for arrogance is equal to them all. However, with regard to humble people, it is written, the humble will inherit the land and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. That's from Psalm 37. That concludes chapter 2. We move on to chapter 3, which is all about the laws of the lulav and esrog, the 4 species that we lift and wave during Sukkot. This is going to be a branch from the date palm, a branch from the willow tree, a branch from the myrtle tree, and the fruit known as an esrog, or in English, a citron. Looks a little bit like a lemon, but it's not a lemon. Right, and so those 4, and it's the fruit of a beautiful tree, and you take those 4 species together, we make a blessing, and we wave them during Sukkot. That is a Torah commandment. Now we're going to be learning the laws of the 4 species. Mishna number 1 here of chapter 3. We're on the B side of page 29. A lulav that was stolen or that is completely dry is unfit for use in fulfilling the commandment of the 4 species. What do we have here? This is my date palm branch, the lulav, from last year's Sukkot. The willow branch and the myrtle are long gone. This is the date palm branch. It is completely dry. It was sitting there in the back of my office all year long. And as we've just read, I could not use this to fulfill my obligation this year. It's the right species, the right size. It was a very nice one when it was new, but now it is completely dry and therefore not fit for using it this year. The lulav of a tree worshipped as idolatry, that was an Asherah tree, and the lulav from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry and which must be burned along with all the city's property, these are unfit for using. If the top of the lulav was severed, or if the palm leaves were severed from the spine of the lulav, it is unfit. If its leaves, although still attached, were spread and are no longer completely joined to the spine, it is fit. Rabbi Yehuda says, in that case, one should bind the lulav from the top to join the leaves that spread to the spine. And you see this kind of binding. Now it's all dried up, but there was this binding also made from the lulav itself that was the binding to keep this branch together. And I'll be getting that, the new one pretty soon. Rosh Hashanah is coming up, then Yom Kippur, and then we're getting our lulav and esrog for Sukkot, which starts 5 days after Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yehuda says, in that case, one should bind the lulav from the top. A lulav from the palms of the Iron Mountains are fit for use, although this palm differs from one taken from a standard palm tree in that its leaves are shorter and do not cover the entire spine. A lulav that has 3 handbreadths in length, sufficient to enable one to wave with it, is fit for fulfilling the mitzvah. The Gemara asks, granted, a dry lulav is unfit both on the first day and subsequently. Now, the Gemara is going to make a distinction between the first day of Sukkot, or outside the land of Israel, the first 2 days, which are full-fledged festival days. You cannot do any work, just like Shabbos. The only difference between the first 2 days of Sukkot outside of Israel, or the first day of Sukkot within Israel. The only difference between that festival day and Shabbos is that you can cook on a festival, but all other forms of work are prohibited, just as on Shabbos. Then you go to the intermediate days of the festival, called Chol HaMoed, and there the rules are a little bit more relaxed. You can go to work, you can do work, not on the Shabbos in the intermediate days. It's still the festival, but it's a little bit lower sanctity. The commandment to wave the lulav on the actual festival day, the first day of the festival, or the first 2 days outside of Israel, that's by Torah commandment. We do wave the lulav and esrog every day of Sukkot, but after the initial festival day, it becomes not a Torah commandment, but a rabbinic commandment, and so the rules are going to be slightly different. Granted, a dry lulav is unfit both on the first day and subsequently. It is unfit for use because the term hadar is used with regard to the 4 species, from which it is derived that we require beauty. We have to have beautiful examples of the palm branch, the willow branch, the myrtle branch, and the esrog itself. They need to be beautiful. They can't be dried up, stained, ugly, right? There's all kinds of rules about how nice they need to be. A nice example of the 4 species. However, since in a dry lulav there is not beauty, it is unfit. However, with regard to a stolen lulav, which we'll be reading about, well, the Mishna started by saying a lulav that was stolen or that is completely dry is unfit for use in fulfilling the commandment. But the Gemara is asking, with regard to a stolen lulav, granted, on the first day of the festival, it is unfit for use in fulfilling one's obligation, because Leviticus 23:40 says, "And you shall take for yourselves on the first day." Take for yourselves, meaning take from your own property. If you stole it from someone else, you can't fulfill your obligation with it. That's on the first day, during the full festival day, indicating that the 4 species must be taken from your own property. However, beginning on the second day of the festival, why does one not fulfill his obligation with a stolen lulav? And Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, it is unfit because it is a commandment that comes to be fulfilled by means of a transgression, which renders the mitzvah unfulfilled. As it is stated, "And you have brought that which was stolen, and the lame, and the sick. That is how you bring the offering. Should I accept this of your hand, says the Lord?" That's from Malachi 1:13. Based on the juxtaposition in the verse, it is derived that the legal status of a stolen animal is equivalent to that of a lame or blemished animal, just as a blemished animal has no remedy and is unfit for use, so too a stolen animal has no remedy. There's no difference before the owners reach a state of despair of recovering the stolen animal, and there is no difference after. In the law of stolen goods, we distinguish between something that was stolen and the owner has despaired of ever recovering it versus something that was stolen and the owner still thinks he can get it back. But with respect to can you fulfill your obligation with a stolen lulav, it doesn't matter whether the owner has despaired of recovering it or not. We're on page 30. Skip a paragraph and we read, "And Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, what is the meaning of that which is written? For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery in a burnt offering." Isaiah 61:8. The Gemara cites a parable of a flesh and blood king who was passing by a customs house. He said to his servants, "Pay the levy to the taxmen." They said to him, "Doesn't all the tax in its entirety belong to you? If the taxes will ultimately reach the royal treasury, what is the point of you, the king, paying the taxman or the toll collector as you're going by this road?" And the king said to them, "From my conduct, all travelers will learn and will not evade payment of the tax. And so too the Holy One, blessed be he, said, I, the Lord, hate robbery in a burnt offering. Although the whole world is his and the acquisitions of man have no impact upon him, God says, from my conduct, my children will learn and distance themselves from robbery, even from robbery unrelated to the needs of offerings. Now we skip a couple of pages. We're at the top of page 31. The sages taught with regard to a stolen sukkah and with regard to one who roofs a sukkah in the public domain, right? Not on his property, but in public property, and which is tantamount to robbing land from the public. Rabbi Eliezer deems these sukkahs unfit for use and fulfillment of the mitzvah, but the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer say that the rabbis deem them fit. You can't fulfill your obligation to waive the 4 species with a stolen lulav. But it seems that with a stolen sukkah, you can. What does this mean? Rav Steinsaltz has a note. A stolen sukkah is fit. How so? In a case where one builds a sukkah and a thief forcibly removes him from the sukkah, and now the thief sits in this person's sukkah, the thief is actually sitting in a borrowed sukkah, because the land is not stolen. You can't steal land in this context. This is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. The Rima wrote, however, one should not sit in another's sukkah without his knowledge, ab initio, and all the more so, one should not sit in another person's sukkah if his intention is to steal it. Similarly, one may not build his sukkah in a public domain, ab initio. However, one fulfilled his obligation after the fact. Some authorities rule that one should not recite a blessing over a stolen sukkah. However, later authorities are lenient in this matter. However, if one stole a sukkah that was not attached to the ground, he actually picked up the sukkah and took it somewhere else and then used it as his sukkah, then he has completely failed to fulfill his obligation. So this idea that you could kick somebody out of their sukkah and then use that sukkah to fulfill your obligation, it's sort of like a technicality that would make it work, but it is considered by the sages abominable behavior. We skip a little more. We're on 31a. Ravina said, with regard to the stolen large beam of a sukkah, the sages instituted an ordinance that the robber need not return it intact due to the general ordinance of a beam. So this has to be, there's a whole body of law about this, where if you stole like a beam, like a serious, solid, big beam of wood, and then you incorporated it into your house, it was built in the construction of the house. Later, you repent that you stole the beam. You stole this wood from a construction site, and you use it to build your house. It was only one beam that what you needed, you stole it. Now it's in your house. Now, you repent your theft. You want to return what you stole. But in order to return that beam that you incorporated into your house, you would have like a tremendous construction project to unbuild the whole roof of your house, take out this beam and return it. So the sages instituted to encourage people to make an atonement for theft, that what you would owe is the monetary value of the beam that you stole plus a penalty, but you wouldn't have to actually extract that beam from your house. That's in the law of permanent dwellings. Now this is getting applied to sukkah. So Ravina said, with regard to the stolen large beam of a sukkah, the sages instituted an ordinance that the robber need not return it intact due to the general ordinance of the beam. By the letter of the law, so I just explained it, and the law on this, a thief is obligated to return the object that he stole. By Torah law, even if he stole a beam and built it into a building, he's required to dismantle the structure and return the beam to the original owner. However, the sages instituted an ordinance that the penitent need return only the monetary value of the beam. Similarly, if one stole a beam and built it into his sukkah, and the owner demands its return, the thief need return only the beam's monetary value during the festival of Sukkot. But after the festival, since it's a temporary structure anyway, then he must return the beam itself. The master stated in the Baraisa cited above, if one cannot find an esrog, the citron, that yellow fruit, he may not bring a pomegranate, a quince, or any other kind of fruit in place of the citron. And the Gemara wonders, this is obvious. The Gemara answers, well, lest you say he should bring these fruits so that the halachic category of the esrog will not be forgotten, to have an actual fruit alongside the 3 kinds of branches. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda teaches us that it is in fact prohibited because on occasion damage will result from this practice. Some may come to be drawn drawn to this practice and use these species even when estrogim are available. So in other words, if for some reason a citron became completely unavailable, you were in a place where you just couldn't get it, you could get the date palm branch and the myrtle and the willow. You couldn't get the citron, so then you should just waive the 3 species. You shouldn't substitute an apple or a pomegranate or some other fruit saying, well, I know it's not a citron, but I just want to have a fruit alongside with these other 3 species. It's prohibited because that may become your practice for a few years when the estrog is not available. Some people will observe that. They'll come to think that it's okay to use some other fruit, and harm will ensue because the mitzvah will be performed inappropriately. We're now going to skip several pages. Page 32 and 33 of Tractate Sukkot. You know, most people, most Jews, when they're getting ready for Sukkot and they're getting their lulav and estrog, so they go to a store or a temporary store that's set up around the time of Sukkot, and you buy the proper date palm bound in the right way, the proper willow branches and myrtle branches and the citron, and you just get the whole thing as a kit for a good price. If you're, really wanting to do this on your own, identifying the right kind of date palm leaf, the right kind of willow, the right kind of myrtle, the right kind of estrog, so these pages are for you. These are the technical details of lulav and estrog. Now we are at page 32b, Mishna number 2 of chapter 3. A myrtle branch that was stolen or that is completely dry is unfit. A myrtle branch of a tree worshipped as idolatry, or a myrtle branch from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry, is unfit. If the top of the myrtle branch was severed, if the leaves were severed completely, or its berries were more numerous than its leaves, it is unfit. If one diminished their number by plucking berries so that the berries no longer outnumber the leaves, then the myrtle branch becomes fit. But one may not diminish the number of berries on the festival itself, right? Because just like Shabbos, you can't harvest. You can't do the prohibited labor of harvesting, and picking berries of a branch is like harvesting. Skipping forward, now I'm on the A side of page 33. The Gemara asks, who is the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnaic period, who taught in the Baraisa, there is a mitzvah, a commandment to bind the myrtle and the willow with the lulav, right? There's a date palm branch, willow branch, myrtle branch. Who is it that said we bind these 3 kinds of branches together? There is a mitzvah to bind the myrtle and the willow with the lulav, and if he did not bind it, it is still fit. Whose opinion is this? If the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, well, when he did not bind it, why is it fit? If Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bind it and then you didn't bind it, why would it be fit? It should be unfit. Or if this is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, what mitzvah did he perform? Since the rabbis say that you don't have to bind it, what mitzvah did you perform by binding it? And the Gemara answers, actually, it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And the reason that there is an actual commandment to bind the 3 branches together is due to the fact at Exodus 15:2, it is stated, "This is my God, and I will glorify him," which the sages interpreted to mean, beautify yourself before God in the performance of the commandments. It's a general commandment that, if possible, make the commandments that you observe, make them beautiful. Do it in a beautiful way, right? And that's why if you look at the cover on a Torah scroll, it's always made beautiful, right? You don't just put like a bunch of rags to cover up a Torah scroll. You make a beautiful Torah cover. Or at our Shabbos table, when we cover the bread while we're making the blessing over the wine, the challah cover is usually a beautiful challah cover. And you always want to, or a Kiddush cup is usually a beautiful cup if possible. And that's beautifying the mitzvah, and that is a mitzvah in itself. Skipping some more, now I'm near the end of the B side of page 33. Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 3. A willow branch that was stolen or is completely dry, unfit. One from a willow branch from a tree that was worshipped for idolatry, or from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry, it is unfit. If the top was severed or its leaves were severed, or it is the tzaftzapha, which we're going to be talking about, that is a different species of willow tree. There are different kinds of willow trees, and the tzaftzapha is a species that is similar to, but not actually the right kind of willow, and the tzaftzapha is a branch from that kind of tree is unfit. However, a willow branch that is slightly dried, one that a minority of its leaves fell off, and a branch from a willow that does not grow by the river, but instead is from a non-irrigated field, it is fit. You can use these branches. That was the Mishnah. Now we're on the A side of page 34. The sages taught in a baraisa, willows of the brook, right? So the commandment is you shall take a branch from the willow of the brook. And this is referring to those willow trees that grow by the river. And this comes to exclude the tzaftzapha, which grows among the mountains and not near a brook. So we're distinguishing between the willow of the brook, the willow that grows near water, and the willow that grows on the mountains. A branch that you need for Sukkot is from the willow of the brook and not from the mountain willow. Why? Rabbi Zera said, what is the verse from which the fact that the mountain willow is unfit? From where do we derive this? It is derived from a reprimand that was written in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 17:5. The verse says, he, meaning God, placed it by great waters and set it as a tzaftzapha. Who set it as a tzaftzapha? Who set it as a mountain willow? The Jewish people were planted like a willow beside abundant waters, but ultimately they became like a mountain willow. Apparently, a tzaftzapha does not grow on great waters. And Abaye said to Rabbi Zera, and perhaps the second part of the verse is merely explaining the first part. It means he placed it by great waters. And what is it that he placed there? It is the tzaftzapha. Right? It's like the mountain willow could be planted by great waters. And Rabbi Zera answered, well, if so, and that is the meaning of the verse, then what is the meaning of the term set it? Rather, the verse means that the willow branch was transformed into a tzaftzapha. And that is how Rabbi Abahu explained the verse, as Rabbi Abahu said that the Holy One, blessed be he, said, God said, God said that the Jewish people should be before me as a plant placed beside great waters. And what is that plant? It is a willow. But what did the Jewish people do? They set themselves as a tzaftzapha of the mountains. In other words, God gave the Jewish people Torah. When we look to the Torah and the whole Torah tradition and all of the inherited wisdom that the sages have given to us by interpreting Torah and the oral tradition, both the written Torah and the oral Torah, etc., we have a tremendous body of wisdom that emanates from God, God's self, and has grown and been elucidated and clarified for all these centuries. And when we look to that body of wisdom, for the wisdom in our lives, for guidance in our lives, then we're going to lead healthy, meaningful lives. But what do the enemies of the Jewish people, meaning ourselves, what do we do all too often? We look to other places. And of course, there's other sources of wisdom in the world besides Torah. We're not saying that there isn't. But all too often, what Jews are doing when they look to these other sources of wisdom is they're just looking for something that will justify doing what they want to do, right? People have their own urges, their own animal urges, and they're looking for some philosophy that they can find in the world that says, yeah, follow your own animal urges, that's good. And they say, okay, well, somebody said it, it's in print. Some old man with a beard said it somewhere, so now I can justify my behavior and just do what I really feel like doing, right? That's making yourself into a mountain willow rather than drinking deep from the abundant waters of Torah that God has granted to us. God planted us beside abundant waters. If we remove ourselves from drinking from the brook and just go drink from some other, some other source, really to justify our own, often appalling urges, we go way astray. It's a beautiful lesson. Mishnah number 4. We're on the B side of page 34. Rabbi Yishmael says, the mitzvah of the 4 species is to take 3 myrtle branches and 2 willow branches, 1 lulav, 1 date palm, and 1 esrog, the citron. With regard to the myrtle branches, even if the tops of 2 of them are severed and the top of 1 is not severed, it is fit. Rabbi Tarfon says, even if the tops of all 3 are severed, it is fit. Rabbi Akiva says, with regard to the number of each of the species, just as there is 1 date palm and 1 esrog, so too it's okay to have 1 myrtle branch and 1 willow branch. What is the law of this? The halacha is one takes 1 lulav, 1 date palm branch, 2 willow branches, 3 myrtle branches, and 1 esrog ab initio. That is the proper way to do it. If he took only 1 willow branch, he is required to bring a second one and repeat the blessing. In exigent circumstances, one fulfills his obligation with 1 myrtle branch, provided that it is complete in accordance with the understanding of Rabbi Yishmael, but that is not the right way to do it. That was a quick Mishnah. Now Mishnah number 5, near the bottom of page 34b. An esrog that was stolen or is completely dry is unfit. One that was taken from a tree that was worshipped for idolatry, or from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry, is unfit. The same teaching we had for each of the other species in the 4 species. An esrog that is fruit that grew on a tree during the 3 years after it was planted. We're not allowed to harvest fruit from a fruit tree during its first 3 years. In the 4th year, we take those growths as an offering to the Holy Temple, and then in the 5th year, we can use them freely in the 5th year of the life of the tree. So if you harvest an esrog from a tree in its first 3 years, that is unfit. Even though you're not going to eat it, neither can you use it as an esrog for the 4 species of Sukkot, because it is prohibited to eat and to derive benefit from it. An esrog of impure teruma, meaning it was set aside to give to a priest and then it became tameh, ritually impure, it is unfit for use on Sukkot. With regard to the esrog of pure teruma, it was set aside for a priest and it remained ritually pure. One may not take it ab initio, and if one took it, it is fit, although he shouldn't have done it because only a priest should be able to use that fruit. And he fulfilled his obligation after the fact. He shouldn't have done it, but technically he's okay. With regard to the esrog of demai, meaning that you got it from an ignorant Jew and you're not sure whether he tithed it when he harvested it from his tree, Beis Shammai, the followers of Shammai, say this is unfit, you can't use it for Sukkot. Beis Hillel, the followers of Hillel, say it is fit. And with regard to an esrog of the second tithe in Jerusalem, one may not take it ab initio, but if he did take it, it is fit. If boil-like blemishes arose on the majority of the esrog, or if its pestle-like protuberance on the upper blossom end was removed, if the esrog was peeled or split or pierced and is missing any amount, it is unfit. However, if the boil-like blemishes arose only in a minority of the fruit, or if its stem which connects it to the tree was removed, or if it was pierced but is not missing any amount, it is fit. A cushy esrog, which is black like a cushy, is unfit. And with regard to an esrog, a kuti, which is black like a kuti, is unfit. And with regard to an esrog that is leek green, Rabbi Meir deems it fit, and Rabbi Yehuda deems it unfit. What is the minimum measure of a small esrog? Rabbi Meir says it may be no smaller than a walnut. Rabbi Yehuda says it may be no smaller than an egg. And in a large esrog, the maximum measure is so that one could hold 2 esrogim in one hand. That is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef says it is fit, even if it is so large that he can hold only 1 in his 2 hands. And indeed, there are esrogim, plural of esrog, there is an esrog that exists out there that grows on trees. I've seen them myself many times that are big, really big esrog. Some giant, like a basketball, and you could use that, although not ideal, perhaps. That was the Mishnah number 5. Now we skip several pages about the technical requirements of an esrog. If you're curious about that, page 35, page 36. And we go to the end of the discussion of Mishnah number 5, and this is on page 36 on the B side. And the Mishnah continues, and then a large esrog, the maximum measure so that one could hold 2 in his one hand. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says, it is fit, even if it is so large that he can hold only 1 in his 2 hands. It is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei said there was an incident involving Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, who came to the synagogue, and his esrog was so large that he carried it on his shoulder. Apparently, one can fulfill his obligation with a large esrog. Rabbi Yehuda said to him, is this proof from there? In that case, too, the sages said to Rabbi Akiva, that is not a beautiful esrog. It's too gargantuan. It doesn't work. What is the law of the large esrog? There is no maximum measure of an esrog. Even an exceedingly large one is fit. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, as the halacha is ruled in his favor in disputes with Rabbi Yehuda. So there you go, as big as you want. Mishnah number 6. One may bind the lulav only with its own species, i.e. with one of the 4 species taken with the lulav. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says one may do so even with a string or with a cord. Rabbi Meir says there was an incident involving the men of Jerusalem who would bind their lulavim with gold rings. And the sages said to him they would bind it with its own species beneath the rings. The rings serve merely a decorative purpose and not a halachic one. Binding the lulav, based on the principle, beautify yourself before him. In the performance of mitzvos, there is a commandment to bind 3 of the species together with at least 1 double knot. One may use any material to tie them, but the custom for many generations has been to tie them with the leaf of a lulav. Some tie the species together with 5 knots based on Kabbalistic teachings. And so you see from last year, this one's dry, we can't use it, but still for illustrative purposes, here this is actually a leaf like one of these leaves, but a thinner one that was, sort of used to tie the lulav together. And then there were other leaves like this that bound the willow and the myrtle to the lulav all in one package. If you then, wanted to decorate that by putting some kind of a gold ring around it, that would be okay, just for decorative purposes, but the binding has to be done with the 4 species itself. Mishnah number 7 on the B side of page 37. And where in the recitation of Hallel would they wave the lulav? Now, Hallel, this is the special Hallel. It's a special addition to the prayer service that we have on festivals. We recite Hallel. We also do it at Rosh Chodesh, the first day of every Hebrew month. We do it every day of Sukkot. We do it every day of Passover. We do it on Shavuos. We do it on festival days. We add the Hallel. With some exceptions, there's some other stuff that's in there, but basically Hallel is reciting and usually singing, if possible, Psalms 113 through 118. And we do it after the morning prayers and before the Torah service of the morning prayers. And so when we do it during Sukkot, when we recite the Hallel, we pick up our lulav and esrog and we wave them during Hallel. And where in the recitation of Hallel would they wave the lulav? They would do so at the verse, thank the Lord for he is good. Hoidu Lashem ki tov. Ki liolam hazo. Thank the Lord for he is good. His kindness is forever. Psalm 118 verses 1 and 29. That appears at both the beginning and the end of the psalm. And also at the verse, Lord, please save us. Ana Hashem, Hoshiana, right? And we wave it there. Please, God, save us. Hoshiana, save us. And this is the statement of Beis Hillel. And Beis Shammai say they would wave the lulav even at the verse, Ana Hashem, Hatzlichana, Lord, please grant us success. Rabbi Akiva said, I was observing Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua and saw that all the people were waving their lulavim, and the two of them waved their lulav only at Lord, please save us, indicating that this is actually the law. We learned now the Gemara. We learned in a Mishna there in Tractate Menachos at 61a with regard to the 2 loaves and the 2 lambs. So this Mishnah just said where in the Hallel do we wave the lulav, right? So we know that there's a mitzvah in the Torah. It says take the lulav, that you take it, meaning like pick it up. What about waving? Where did this come into it? Already we're asking at what point in Hallel do we wave it? But what the Gemara now asks is, well, wait a minute. Where do we get this idea of waving it at all? Before we move on to the question of when in the prayer service do we wave it, where do we get this idea of waving? The Torah said, pick it up. Waving, meaning wave it in the 4 directions, right? East, south, west, north, up, and down. Those are the 6 directions that we wave the lulav, meaning, meaning wave it to the whole world. Like those 6 directions cover the whole world. Why do we wave the lulav? From where is this derived? So we learned in a Mishnah there, with regard, in Menachos 61a, with regard to the 2 loaves and the 2 lambs, which are offered at the festival of Shavuos, right? We had that some months ago when we celebrate the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. And during that festival, there are 2 loaves of wheat bread, which are waved, and 2 lambs, which are the sacrifices of that day. And before they're brought as offerings, they are waved, right? And so how is that waving performed? So he places the 2 loaves on top of the 2 lambs, and he places his hand beneath them, and he waves them to and fro to each side, and he raises and lowered them, as it is stated, Exodus 29:27, which is waved and which is lifted, indicating that there is waving to the sides as well as raising and lowering. Rabbi Yochanan said, he moves them, the lambs and the loaves, he moves them to and fro to dedicate them to he to whom the 4 directions are his, meaning God. So the 4 directions are God's, meaning God is everywhere. The whole world is God. So when you wave something in all 4 directions, east, south, west, north, it means you're covering the whole world and acknowledging that the whole world is God's and that God is everywhere. And he raises and lowers them to he whom the heavens and the earth are his, right? So the way we dwell on earth, the surface of the earth, that's more or less 2-dimensional, right? In terms of the way we live, right? Just on the surface of the earth. So that's why north, south, east, west. But up and down represents the heavens and the earth. And now we've covered the whole universe. And so the waving is done in 6 directions. In the West, in Eretz Yisrael, they taught it as follows. Rabbi Chama bar Ukva said that Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, he moves them, the lambs and the loaves, to and fro in order to request a halt to harmful winds and storms and tempests that come from all directions. And he raises and lowers them in order to halt harmful dews and rains that come from above. Rabbi Yosef bar Avin said, and some said that it was Rabbi Yosef bar Zavila who said, that is to say, non-essential aspects of a commandment help avert calamity, as waving is a non-essential aspect of the mitzvah, since even if one failed to wave the loaves, he still fulfilled his obligation by bringing them as an offering, and nevertheless, the waving halts harmful winds and waters, like dew and rain, unnecessary, too much dew and rain. And Rava said, and likewise, one should conduct himself the same way with a lulav. So we're learning the law of waving the 4 species at Sukkot from the law of the loaves and lambs at Shavuos, i.e., one should wave it to and fro and raise and lower it for the same reasons. When Rav Acha bar Yaakov would move the lulav to and fro, he would say, this is an arrow in the eye of Satan, as despite his best efforts, the Jewish people continue to joyously fulfill mitzvos. Right? So Satan is the prosecuting angel who comes before the Lord and says, look how badly the Jewish people are behaving. But sometimes he also tries to entrap them. And so that's why sometimes we say that Satan is equated with our own Yetzer Hara, our own evil inclination, to laziness and to all the other wicked deeds that we do. And the Gemara notes, that is not a proper manner of conduct, as it will induce Satan to come and incite him to sin. Don't gloat over the fact that you're defeating Satan. Gloating due to his victory over the evil inclination will lead Satan to redouble his efforts to corrupt him. So you should never think that you have, conquered Satan. In other words, that you have conquered your own evil inclinations. You should always be humble before your evil inclination and recognize that you need to pray for help every day to continue conquering your evil inclination, lest it rise up and overwhelm you and lead you to sin. That concludes a discussion of Mishnah number 7. Here's Mishnah number 8. With regard to one who was coming along the way and he did not have a lulav in his hand to take and fulfill the mitzvah while he's traveling, so when he enters his house to eat, he should take the lulav at his table. He interrupts his meal to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav. If he did not take the lulav in the morning, he should take it in the afternoon, as the entire day is suited for fulfilling the commandment of lulav. We are, going to soon be at the end, so if you have comments and questions, get them in. The halacha, the law on eating before taking the lulav. It is prohibited to eat prior to taking the lulav. Right? So during Sukkot, you're going to take the lulav and make that blessing. You should do that first thing in the day and then eat. If one forgets and begins eating, then on the first day, when the commandment of taking the lulav is by Torah law, he should interrupt his meal and take the lulav and make the blessing, even if there remains sufficient time to do so later in the day. On all the other days of the festival, if there's sufficient time to take the lulav later after the meal, then he should not interrupt his meal. If he began his meal with more than half an hour prior to the time when the lulav may be taken, he did not interrupt his meal in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera. That's all for Mishnah number 8. Mishnah number 9. With regard to one for whom a Canaanite slave, a woman, or a minor was reciting Hallel, he repeats after them what they are saying word for word. What's going on here? A Canaanite slave, a woman, or a minor are not obligated in Hallel, right? A woman is not obligated in time-bound positive commandments. So the question is, can you fulfill your obligation by listening to somebody else recite Hallel for you? We're supposed to recite Hallel on festival days. Not everybody's capable of reciting Hallel. Isn't it enough to hear somebody else say it and respond Amen after them? Certainly if the person you're listening to is themselves obligated to recite Hallel. But if you're having somebody recite it for you who themselves is not obligated to recite it, then you have to repeat after them. They're just teaching you how to do it, but you're going to remain obligated to do it yourself. So you can repeat after them what they're saying word for word. But the Mishnah notes, and may a curse come upon this person for being so ignorant that he needs these people who are not obligated to recite Hallel to recite it for him. If an adult male was reciting Hallel on his behalf, he need not repeat each word, as the adult male can fulfill the obligation to recite Hallel on his behalf. Rather, the person simply answers Hallelujah to each phrase that is recited. In a place where they were accustomed to repeat certain verses, he too should repeat them. If the custom is to recite them plainly, without repetition, he should recite them plainly. In a place where the custom is to recite a blessing before Hallel, he should recite a blessing. Everything is in accordance with the local custom in these matters. That concludes Mishnah number 9. The law. The halach on this. One who does not know how to recite grace after meals, not just Hallel, but the grace after meals, the Birkat Hamazon. This person can fulfill his obligation to do so if another person who ate with him recites the blessings aloud and he answers Amen at the conclusion of each blessing. A son may recite the grace after meals for his father. A woman may recite for her husband, and a slave may recite for his master. However, the sages said, may a curse come to a man who, due to his ignorance, requires his wife and children to recite a blessing on his behalf. We should learn how to recite blessings on our own behalf. Also, if one is unable to answer Amen, maybe he doesn't have a voice, maybe he can't speak, then he concentrates silently on what he hears and thereby fulfills his obligation. The key is you have to concentrate on what you're listening to. This is because the halakhic status of one who hears a passage recited is equivalent to the one who recites. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9. Now, Mishnah number 10, near the bottom of page 39a. In the case of one who purchases a lulav from another, and the other is an Am Haaretz, an ignorant Jew, and he does this during the sabbatical year when we are not allowed to plant and reap from the ground, right? We don't plant the crops in Israel during the sabbatical year, the 7th year. So if you purchase a lulav from somebody who's an Am Haaretz, who might have planted and harvested because he's ignorant of the law and he doesn't know he's not allowed to do that. So in that case, the seller gives him an esrog along with it as a gift, and he is not permitted to purchase the esrog during the sabbatical year because it is prohibited to engage in commerce with sabbatical year produce. The difference between the esrog and the lulav is that the lulav can be thought of as wood, but the fruit is definitely produce, right? So you can't use the produce, you can't eat it, and you can't derive benefit from it during the sabbatical year in the land of Israel. That doesn't count outside of Israel. With regard to the just a law that is, we are saying in passing, with regard to when do you say the blessing over the lulav and esrog, blessings recited over the performance of mitzvahs must be recited prior to the performance of the mitzvah. With regard to the commandment of lulav, there are several opinions as to where the blessing is recited. The issue here is we are commanded by Torah law to take, right? In other words, to pick up the lulav and esrog during Sukkot. So if you pick it up, you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. But you're supposed to say the blessing before you pick it up. So you could just leave it on the table, say the blessing, and then pick it up. But the sages don't like that because it's a little bit general, a little bit undesignated. So what do people do? According to, with regard to the mitzvah lulav, there are several opinions as to when the blessing is recited. According to the Rambam, Maimonides, one recites the blessing before taking it in his hand. Like you just leave it on the table, say the blessing, and then you pick it up. But many are accustomed to lift the lulav prior to saying the blessing, but they hold the esrog upside down, right? The not ideal way. So you haven't really taken the 4 species together. You're making it a little bit ugly by holding the esrog upside down. So you're holding it in your hand, you say the blessing, and then you flip the esrog the proper way, the way you're going to wave it when you're actually waving it. And that way you finish taking it after you have recited the blessing. Many are accustomed to lift the lulav prior to the blessing, but they hold the esrog upside down. Following recital of the blessing, they restore the esrog to its upright position. And that is the common Ashkenazic practice, the practice of Northern European Jews and their descendants. And the Vilna Gaon holds that one stipulates in advance that he does not intend to fulfill his obligation until after he recites the blessing. Others say that one takes the lulav first, recites the blessing, and then he picks up the esrog. So there's different ways to do this depending on your community. And that's it. That's what I've got for us today. So now we have covered the highlights of so many pages, pages 29 through 40, 12 pages during all these days that we have been apart. I know this was a long class, so I'll just take a couple of questions or comments. Bill, and we may take it as a comment on God's justice versus human justice. Human rulers may have ministers and subordinates that neglect their charges and still prosper, but God ensures that celestial powers can't leave the humans he assigned to them to twist in the wind, at least not alone. So Bill is referring to this teaching we encountered earlier that when a nation of people, right, when a people suffers in this world, their guardian angel suffers along with them, right? It's sort of like they have an eternal mission to be connected to that people. Everyone's guardian angel is forever connected to that nation or to that people. Seraphim Winslow says, I would be surprised to learn that the rabbis taught that anything in this world can act as a cause having an effect in the upper world. It's always the other way around. Cause flows above to below. That's also true, right? That the wars and battles being fought above have an effect on us below. But Judaism teaches absolutely what we do down here has an effect in the upper world, right? And in fact, it's almost like the whole world of souls was created in order to make this world, right? The world we're in now, Olam Hazeh, this world, the world of mortality, the world of souls was actually created so that this world would be possible. God wanted there to be a world where God's presence was hidden and where there would be thinking, conscientious beings who would have a choice to do God's will or not. And that would only be possible if they knew what God's will was, but God would be hidden, and there would even be a question whether God exists at all. And so it would be an act of faith and belief. And when we choose to do good in this world, and especially when we choose to serve God's creatures because God told us to, that gives God great joy, and it brings light and healing, not only in this world, but even in the upper world. Sharon, many shuls have communal lulavim for those who don't have. Can't those individuals fulfill the mitzvah using them even if they chose not to get one for themselves? So we encountered along in today's journey this idea that the four species, you can't steal it. If you steal it, you're not fulfilling your obligation. What about borrowing? You actually have to do it correctly. You're supposed to do it with your own lulav and esrog. Now, some people can't. The lulav and esrog, usually the kit sort of costs about $50, $60. Some people want to get a really beautiful esrog, and they end up spending much, much more. But $50 is beyond the means of certain people, or maybe they just didn't have an opportunity to get a lulav and esrog. Now they're in synagogue with their friend who has a lulav and esrog, and they'd like to fulfill their obligation to wave the lulav and esrog, but they don't have one. Their friend does. What do? The friend says, I give this to you. It is now yours. I freely give it. And so now you've received it as a gift. That's perfectly okay. You wave the lulav and esrog, and then you give it to your friend, not as returning a loan, but as a gift, right? And so these communal lulavim and esrog, I would think that what's actually happening is that the community makes them available, and it's a gift for whoever wants it. You take it, you accept the gift from the community, you use it, you want it to be available for other members of the community to use it also, and now you gift it back to the community. And that way everybody who's doing it is actually performing the waving of the lulav and esrog and the taking and saying the blessing with their own lulav and esrog. Yosef, concerning the esrog, from what I understand, the rabbis derived that it is an esrog to be used because of the way this is the fruit of a good tree, in fact, a beautiful tree, the way that it grows and having something to do with the yovel or the orla. Am I right in the direction of this? Yeah, I just don't remember offhand exactly. It is definitely that they said, what is the fruit of a beautiful tree as commanded in the Torah? Because it doesn't say, take a citron. It is the fruit of a beautiful tree, and somehow that ends up being the citron. I forget exactly how they derive that. I'm sorry I can't have a good, more specific answer right now. So Hannah says, so you can't do esrog during Shemitah, right? So in other words, during that 7th year, where you can't harvest from the field, how do you do it? Well, first of all, you could take an esrog that grew outside of Israel, and there's other kind of mechanisms in place where they make it possible to do, but during a Shemitah year, yet care has to be taken. That's why, like, if you're buying your lulav and esrog, from some kind of kosher store where they're putting it together for you, they're going to take care of whatever those legal mechanisms are, and you don't have to worry about this. If you're doing it on your own, you have to do a little more research on this law. And finally, Caroline, if being able to recite a blessing is important for oneself versus others reciting for one, could the same be said for prayer? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why, for example, in the daily prayer, the Amidah, the standing prayer, right? You can just answer Amen to the prayer leader for all the different sections of the 18 blessings, except the Modim. Modim anachnu lach. We thank you, God. When you're saying thank you to God for the blessings in your life, you can't delegate someone else to say thank you for you. And that's a great lesson. When you owe gratitude to somebody, don't send a messenger to say thank you on your behalf. When it's time to say thank you, you do it yourself. And it's a very good practice to say thank you to God every day, multiple times a day. Even if your life is super tough, you're alive, there are good things in your life that you can name. Say thank you for those, and much blessing will follow. That's what I've got for us today. Well done, my friends. Yasher koach. May you be strengthened to learn and study. Today was a big class. We covered the highlights of pages 29 through 40 during these days that we've been apart. With God's help, we won't have such a big break for a long time. Tomorrow, with God's help, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for a single page 41 here in Tractate Sukkah. Have a great night. Sending you all big